Blizzard has officially revealed a ton of information about 10.1. So what does that mean? Well, it means it's the start of tier list season. It also means the start of my coverage for 10.1. So if you're interested in that, consider subscribing, following the channel. That would help me out. Also, if you like the video, like or comment. Now today, we're going to be doing a tier list on the dungeons for Season 2 of Dragonflight. And you're probably wondering, it's way too early for that, Voodoo. Why are you doing this? And you're right, it is too early. So don't think of this as a, how are these dungeons to run? We'll do that later. For now, I want to rank these based off their potential, right? I want to rank them based off how well I think they'll go into M+, about how good they'll be in the season. There's a few criteria I'm going to primarily be ranking on. Myself as a player, I personally enjoy large pulls and interesting routes. So interesting skips you could do, interesting pulls you could do, that sort of stuff. That's kind of how I end up enjoying dungeons. So linear dungeons are a little less interesting for me. But things with skips, things that are, good in the pull size, you can have some big pulls kind of blast. Those generally do a little bit higher for me overall. I'll have some slight ranking for like thematics of the dungeon, but overall I'm going to do based off of primarily, boss mechanics, trash mechanics, how well I think it'll go in M+, pull, diversity, ingenuity, stuff like that. So we're going to start off with Underrot. Now, Underrot, I think, is going to be a pretty solid dungeon overall. I'm going to slot it into the 8. I think the boss definitely loses a bit because without Awakened, Invis potions are essentially required. If you just straight pull through the dungeon, you'll do like 130% count, which isn't amazing. But I do have fond memories of Underrot. I think overall the dungeon's pretty good. I think the last boss kind of sucks, but the rest of the dungeon is pretty fun to do. There are some fun skips you can do along the edges of things. There's some interesting ideas with maybe pulling some trash into the Krog boss as well if you need time, like a little bit of a risky play there. And there are some skips you can do, but you do need stealth pots. But hey, is what it is. Making more money for the alchemists, whatever. I think Underrot is going to be a pretty decent dungeon. Maybe not the best overall, but it's going to be very fun to run. It's going to be one of your favorite ones probably. I love Underrot personally, and it drops the Underrot Krog tusks. So that's up. Next up, we are going to Vortex Pinnacle. The Vortex Pinnacle is going to be very interesting because this is the only dungeon so far we haven't seen on either a Mythic 0 or an M+ mode. The rest of them all had M+ or M0 and whatever, but this is our first recurring dungeon from pre-Legion and the only one for the season. So in that case, Vortex Pinnacle, I think it could either be B, based if it's tuned well, or it could be like a C or a D if it's not tuned well. So I'm going to slot it in the B tier. I think Vortex Pinnacle looks like a cool dungeon, right? Like it visually is a cool dungeon. You're flying around between all these pillars and stuff. But I do think there's a lot of kicks that could happen in this dungeon. Some of those mobs could be very difficult, like the big walking storm dragons could be pretty deadly. The bosses, there's only 3 of them, so that doesn't seem too bad. People will definitely die to the last bosses like Thunderdome a few times at the start of the season, but is what that is. But I do think that if it's tuned poorly, it'll end up being a pretty bad dungeon. I don't think there's anything too exciting you can do in the routing. Off the top of my head, the dungeon is fairly linear in that regard, as you're just kind of walking forward to each kind of top of the platform and then moving on to the next. There's not too much you could do. I think there might be some funky stair skips, like stealth skips. I remember this was part of time walking for a bit, but that was a little while ago, so I don't fully remember all these skips and everything for that one. But I think if it's tuned fairly well, then you could see this move up to a B tier. If it's tuned poorly, down to a D tier. I think next up is going to be Brackenhide Hollow. Brackenhide Hollow, I'm going to put in the D tier. Now, again, this dungeon has not been tuned for Mythic Plus, so keep that in mind. This could move up. But personally, I just don't enjoy the dungeon. I think the bosses all kind of suck. They're either a little bit too hard or they're just kind of boring and don't do anything. The trash itself, while I do think there's lots of pull creativity, it'll be hard to say what the count will be. If the count is reasonable, then you're going to have to end up pulling just a lot of the dungeon to get that count. If it's too low, then you have to be using skips to get the count. And if it's too high, then you have to go out of your way to do the count. So either way, I feel like you're going to have to pull a lot of trash. The trash mobs at the start of the dungeon suck. There's so many kicks and stops and fears and whirlwinds. And that theme kind of just carries throughout, unless you go left side first. But all in all, I do think there's just a lot wrong with this dungeon. I think the first part where you have to free all the Tuskar kind of sucks as well. So we'll see what happens when they edit it for M+, but frankly, off the rip, I'm not Next up, oh, it's Freehold. It's back. Now, I want to give Freehold an S tier. I do think it's going to be the best dungeon this season by far. It's going to be your fan favorite. It's so fun to run. The theming is there. The trash is really fun. The pulls you can do are great. The like dynamics of the area is great. The pacing's good. But I do think there are some issues, so I'm going to bump it down to A. But again, it's my favorite of the season by far. I think it'll be great to run. It's the best dungeon in my opinion, but we're going to put it down in A tier for a few reasons. Now, this is because I think this dungeon could be. I think the bosses are definitely the hard and boring parts of this dungeon. Every single boss has some form of bait to it, which I don't think is great design. You have shark bait charge on Sky Captain Crag. You have a few different baits on the 3 pirates. You have the gun, you have the haymaker, you have the barrel, and you have like the sword spin. You have the sharks on the 3rd boss, and then you have the cannons on the 4th boss. So I think all the bosses themselves do have a little bit of issues there with kind of their baiting and what you have to do for that dungeon. But I do think overall the dungeon is amazing. I think the trash is not too hard, but also not too easy, where it just doesn't do anything. I think there's some fun pulls you can do. The route you do is pretty fun. Again, though, maybe the packs at the end of the dungeon, too, could be touched up a little bit. As it stands, you kind of skip the pack right where Harlan Sweet is, the last boss, and like fight him off to the side, which limits your space for that boss and does make it a little bit harder and a little bit worse. So we'll see if Blizzard comes in and does some tuning to kind of alleviate those bosses, make them a bit better, and maybe raise this up into S tier as it should be. So next is Halls of Infusion. Now, honestly, I'm going to put this down in C tier for a few reasons. I think, like Brackenhide Hollow, there's just some issues with how the dungeon is constructed. I think the gauntlet at the end of the dungeon sucks. I think it's so terrible. I think having to fight that stuff in an M+ pull while worrying about being knocked off the side or being hit by the waves, stopping the frost things from duplicating, there's dragons breathing. I think there's just too much in that last gauntlet. I think the frogs also kind of suck. The frog boss and all the little mini frogs. You can't top them off. They have to die very quickly or else you're going to just die from the poison. There's a bunch of just stuns and stops that will go onto you, the player. You can get dazzled, which will stun you. There's beams in the first trash that will stun you. You have to pull one of the first 2 packs unless you invis skip, which I think is stupid. Like it looks like you can run down the middle, but you can't. And then there's other stuff like all those like in between the 2nd and the 3rd boss with the dragons and all the things. And there's like a tornado that can go on you that stuns you for 10 seconds. The 3rd boss, it just does its cycles too quickly to do any. There's a lot of issues with it. Now there's gonna be good loot here. Iridius Fragment is crazy, so people will want to be here. And I do think the last boss is pretty fun. So I think if there's some tuning done to it, maybe they remove some stuff from the packs because there's way too many kicks and everything. Then this could be higher, but for now, because of all the kicks and stuff, I'm gonna give it C tier. Next up is Lair of Neltharius. I'm gonna slot this in B tier. I personally have a fond memory of Lair of Neltharius. I enjoyed running it in Legion M+. I sped ran it when I was farming High Mountain Tauren rep on my Druid, so it was really fun kind of getting down the fast runs. And I think that overall the general aesthetic is pretty nice. It is a dungeon on rails, but there are some skips you can do in it to kind of save you on your some pull count and stuff like that. I do think things negative to it, A, it's a linear dungeon. Those are never the most fun. B, it has a worm boss. Worm bosses are just pretty universally kind of just garbage. So that does suck. But I do think that overall it's a very solid dungeon. It's very pretty. The river is fun. The trash itself is pretty enjoyable. There's some bigger pulls you can do because it's a Legion dungeon. So there's some mobs that don't do anything, thankfully. But overall, I think it is very solid and a nice B choice. Next up is going to be Neltharius. I'm going to put this in B as well. Neltharius itself, I think it suffers the most from a death skip, which honestly I don't mind too much, but I know a lot of people will. And also the fact that you kind of have to just walk a lot and fall down onto the central platform from the 2 sides. I think that's kind of dumb. I definitely think some kind of like teleporter back to the middle or some other way of making it so you don't just take the 4-story drop to the floor below would be good. But I do like the bosses. The bosses are honestly pretty reasonable and pretty fair. I think the 2nd boss kind of sucks, but the rest of them are all pretty doable. They're simple while having some complex mechanics, which I think is good for Mythic Plus bosses and bosses. The trash itself seems pretty fine. There's not too many kicks. There are enough things going on where you're not bored, but there's not too many kicks where overall it's like feels oppressive or feels pretty hard. I do think maybe they could touch up some of the pack sizes or some of the a little bit towards the end there, with like Army of Flame and stuff like that. I do think the last area is much harder than the rest of it. But overall, I think the dungeon is reasonable. It's pretty fun. There are some issues with it, but I think overall it's a solid B tier. For our last dungeon, Return to Uldaman, I'm going to put it in B tier as well. And we got a little pyramid going on here too. So for the dungeon, I do think its biggest bonus to me personally is just its overall kind of pull size. There's lots of big pulls you can do, like at the start, towards the end. So for that, I do think it's pretty fun. But the dungeon is long. It's so long. This could easily be a 40-minute plus timer because of how long the dungeon is. And it's also very linear. Linear dungeons suck. Long dungeons kind of suck. Give us, I don't know, like a Maw. Imagine if Maw of Souls had more pull creativity. That would be great. But honestly, as far as dungeon goes, it's just solid. The bosses, again, are pretty easy without having too many hard mechanics. We'll see how the Golem boss ends up on Mythic Plus. That could be a bit of a wall. But 5 boss dungeons always are kind of a slog. They are a little worse in my opinion. But because of all these big pull sizes, there's lots of trash that doesn't really do too much. I do think it's pretty good. Special note, there's these ones that put out this field that you literally cannot stand in. I do think they needed to be changed. There's definitely the big golems need to be changed and do too much damage as is. So there is some stuff that needs to be touched up, but overall, I think the dungeon itself is in a very solid spot, and I am looking forward to running it in M+. There's some interesting stuff you can get there. The spear fragment could be pretty good. So there's definitely some stuff that I'm looking forward to in that dungeon as well. So these are my thoughts on the potential for each of these dungeons in the next season. I do think the 2 BFA dungeons are going to be the best, and then from there, we'll see about the other ones. Vortex Pinnacle is going to be interesting. It could end up better than I put it, or it could end up worse. And I really do hope they fix up stuff like Brackenhide Hollow and Halls of Infusion. Stuff like that should be made a little bit better than it is currently, so that we have a better season overall and more enjoyment. So that's it for the video today. Leave a like on the video and comment down below if you thought maybe I'm wrong on some of these. Maybe what are your thoughts? I am hoping for some changes coming into these. I think those would make them the best that possibly could be. Really make a fun season. So with that, I will leave you guys. I hope you have a great rest of your Thursday. Again, if you enjoyed the video, hit the sub button too. And with that, I will. A big shout out to my YouTube channel members, Dimmy and Flapjack67. Your guys' support has really helped me make these videos as good as I can. If you're looking to support me and help me make more videos and better videos, then click the link in the description below to learn more about channel membership and get a ton of sweet perks while you help me make this channel as great as it can. Thank you.